I'm also the co-curator of the Light Cycle's 40th anniversary of TRON in Film and Games exhibition that's up currently through August 27th. It'll also be open after the talk if anyone wants to stick around, play some TRON games and see some artifacts from the film. Gamespace doesn't often have public programs unless there's a really, really special occasion. And we have that today. We're all in for a treat, an important time of year, 50-year animation. Bill Kroyer we're grateful to have you join us today, Bill. And when you close your eyes and you think of the movie TRON, the image that comes to mind is, of course, the light cycles. That's why we named our show that's why Disney crafted the ride based around that premise. And it's that masterful piece of film and animation that brings us here today. And we're grateful to you, Bill, for sharing some stories about that segment. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bill.
So yeah, I went on a Chicago events thing and I saw the light cycle thing and I thought, hey, light cycles in Chicago, I should go down there. So I'll just talk a little bit about how we did that. So animating TRON, there I am. That's how I looked in those days. That's when we had those little hats, you know, and they were done. If you've ever seen these in real life, they're pretty crazy. They were like basically, you know, helmets, and then Richard Taylor striking them like down tape, literally with an exactly blade of tape. That's how you did this at circuitry. So I'll just do this. So that was Disney in 1977. That building still looks the same. That's, I don't know if you've ever visited a lot in Burbank, but that's the animation building that he built after Snow White. And all the animators lived in that building. And when I started training at Disney in 1977. That's Mickey Mouse and Billy Grab right there. And we had it next. So anyway, this was an animator in 1927. You know, you sat at a desk with a drawing disc and you had paper on punches and you drew on it, right? With a pencil. That was how you did animation in 1927, actually before that. And then this is 50 years later, in 1977, when I arrived at Disney. It's exactly the same. The technology had not changed at all. Animators sitting at desks with paper on light tables. That's Eric Larson, one of the 9 old men. And if you met them, I was in the training room. That's me in the white shirt with my back to you.
Oh, great.
And, sitting there with Eric Larson. The guy with the long hair on the right is Henry Selick, who directed Coraline and Night Before Christmas. So we were so lucky to be in this animation training program with and Willie Rotherton, one of them was there, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnson. So it was an unusually wonderful thing because we were basically experiencing animation as it had always been done. You know, we walked in just at the tail end before anything changed.
Can I ask how you were selected for the training program?
Sorry?
Can I ask how you were selected for the training program?
It was, you know, here's the thing: is that think how the number of people who can animate is a tiny number of people in the human race can animate with a pencil. And so I didn't have a lot of competition to get in that training program. They had not accepted anybody for 50 years. And all of a sudden they decided, they realized they were running out of people, and so they had a review board. And you're supposed to go in with a portfolio. I never had art school, but I had worked in a commercial studio. I'll abbreviate this. So I had my reel of commercials and I submitted that, and they said, this guy can at least animate. So that's why I got into the training program. Cool. So anyway, the only technology, that's it. So when I was sitting at my desk in 1977 animating, if a Snow White animator from 1930 had walked in, he could sit down and do my job with 0 training. Everything, all the exposure sheets, the scene folders, the scene stacker, everything was unchanged. The only thing different was he wouldn't have to crank the pencil sharpener, although the crank pencil sharpeners were still on the desks. So we all bought our own electric pencil sharpeners. So anyway, again, I did the training program for several years, and then Lisberger came to town. Steve Lisberger, who was an animator from Boston, he sold NBC this special called Olympics, and so he came to Disney. I can't believe they let him in. And he went around the animation department and he basically pissed us on quitting Disney to work for him. And at the time, Disney was going to do Black Collar, which I thought was a terrible movie. You can tell already, and I just thought, this doesn't look fun. Whereas this guy, Steve Lisberger, he seems like a fun guy. So I was the only one. I left Disney, and I went, and because I was the only Disney guy, he made me animation director of this movie. So I go Animal Olympics. So I did that for a year and a half, and then as we were wrapping this up, Steve had this new idea of Tron. Because video games were big, we were all going to the arcade and games, and Steve had this idea. So this is an interesting thing. The very first tests we did on Tron looked like that. Because he had this idea of a person in an electronic world, right? But at the time, nobody knew anything about computer animation. We all knew about drawing characters. So the idea was, why don't we just draw the characters and we'll clean them up with clean lines, and then instead of painting them like we normally do, we'll just photograph those clean lines and we'll make negatives of those, which will mean they'll be black with clear, and then we put lights behind that on the animation stand, and we'll have electronic looking guys. And so the very first character tests on Tron looked like that. Next. And then we had this idea, and then for some reason, Steve started hunting around, where can I sell this movie? And weirdly enough, Disney was the ones doing the bid. And the reason they bid, I don't know if you guys know about film history, but the Disney movies were pretty bad in 1978, 1979. And they hired this young guy named Tom Wellhite to come in and revitalize the company. And he was looking for something new, and here comes Steve Lisberger. I'm going to do a movie about computers. And he went, that sounds revolutionary. So weirdly enough, they hire Steve, and of course he says, well, bring me back a few people, and one of them was my animation director, Bill Kroyer, and I just left 2 years earlier and considered getting the animator. And they said, well, he can't be a director. He's got to be 8 more years. And Steve said, sorry guys, he's my guy. So that's how I leapfrogged the pay scale in the union. I did better. Anyway, so we get back to Disney. So what do we do? Well,
Real
first
quick,
we do
with the Tron character, the Tron character, didn't you guys also sell a version of that character for a commercial?
You know, I'm trying to think if we did something before Tron. I don't think so. I
thought it was a radio
While
spot.
we were in the warehouse in Andalusia, we almost got the script finished, and I was storyboarding sample sequences, and we had a couple of development artists doing stuff. But Steve sold it based on a couple of those tests and a basic idea. So we all moved back to Burbank, back to the animation building. And I found myself back in the same building where I was trained to use before. And then, of course, like any movie, you storyboard, right? So, you know, so filmmaking, but in the animation world, that's Walt Disney showing storyboards back in 1929. Everybody storyboards. And storyboards are hand-drawn, right? And then you put them up on boards like that, and you pitch the sequence, and that's how every movie was made. And, you know, live-action movies often did not do that. You know, like, you would just go out and shoot the movie. But all animated movies did that because there's nothing to shoot, right? I mean, an animated movie, you don't make 10 scenes and decide which one. You only make one scene. So you better know before you make the scene that fits into the other 1,200 scenes, which is why animation is storyboard. Next. So anyway, being animators turned out to be the essential ingredient for making this movie, Tron, because this is the kind of stuff we were getting in 1980. When the word went out to the world, Disney is making an animated film. All you computer animation companies, send us your reels, let's see what you got. That's the kind of stuff we got. That's the New York Institute of Technology right there. I'm not kidding, that literally was the level. It was that, and it was logos. You know, if you look at 1979, you're going to see NBC logos and that kind of stuff. That was it. That was computer animation. That's all it was. So, you know, we started the movie with traditional visual development. And we were talking earlier about this, you know. We didn't put any limitations on the designers. We didn't say, don't worry about how limited the technology is, don't worry about how we're going to make it. Just design a movie that looks right. And design a movie that's a story that fits the story. So, you know, these are, you know, that's like Peter Lloyd. He was the master of airbrush paintings. He started doing those. Some of his first paintings done in the movie. That was actually done back at Lisberger Studios. Did you see?
No, that was just the next slide.
Oh, okay. Anyway, you can see some little thumbnail shots. That was an early MCP thing there with the column. That was the original Solar Sailor idea, going over the simulation right there. Okay, we go to the next one. And then, of course, Steve knew Sid Mead. He knew that this guy was one of the... Sid Mead is a guy, and he was described as a new name. He was called a futurist, because he was doing these amazing paintings of futuristic worlds and vehicles. So Steve heard about that, so he thought, well, this is the guy, right? So he got Sid Mead in, and Sid started designing objects for the movie. And the first thing he did was the life cycle, because it was one of the first sequences we were going to do. Next.
Bill, is it okay if we take pictures? Or do you
No, you can take, there's nothing in here that's, yeah,
Okay.
it's cool. So anyway, these are some Sid's for early pictures. You can see Sid signed every single drawing we did. Next. And it was Sid's designs and the script and kickoff drawings by Mobius, who started the board. Now, how many people have ever heard of Mobius, Jean Giraud? So this guy was a fluke of nature in the most wonderful sense. You know, he was a genius. Like I've known thousands of artists in my life. I've only known one or two that were like Sid Mead. He could literally take a piece of paper and start in the upper left, right, and just start to draw and finish in the lower right, and it's this gorgeous picture of perspective, and he's perfect. And he could draw anything. He was just an amazing artist. So he wanders into our storyboard, which is me and Jerry Riggs storyboarding the whole movie, and Mobius comes in and says, I'm going to help you for a little while. What? And so Jean Giraud comes in, and we start the storyboard, and this is the kind of detail of the storyboards. They're quite simple, you know, as you can see. And one thing you're going to notice right away, hold on right there, is just a little bit of shading. You see how just a little bit of shading on the bike, a little bit of shading on the thing. Believe it or not, that was kind of an important step, because very often in animation storyboarding, if you're going online and looking for it, you'd just be drawings, right? But when Mobius started to board with us, he immediately said to us, you know, I really think that you need to add dimensionality to drawings, because this movie is going to be made in a dimensional world. The computer is a dimensional world, and you're going to be showing these to people who have never worked in film and don't understand what they're looking at. So the more you can help them along by adding dimensionality to drawings, the easier it will be for them to understand what you're doing. And so with just a few cool gray and warm gray markers, we started adding just that little bit to the storyboards, and it just helped make them look more understandable. The red arrow is pointing to the number of the shots, like 39.3, and then if you go to the next slide, it says 18x, that means 18 frames. Because what we did was we storyboard on these pieces of paper, right? And then we just write a little number on the bottom, and we'd send the stack off to animation camera at night, and they would shoot all those, and that would make a story reel. You know, a story reel is a standard process in animation. And then we would have a reel to cut into the rest of the movie. So, as the live action started to be shot, you would go to the editorial room and you would watch the reels, and anything that was animated would be a story reel, because it was going to take months to actually do the animation. So anyway, that's how it started. So here's the light cycle. So you can just flick through these, keep going. And you can see, keep going, you can see now how closely the finished film kind of followed our drawings. You know, being 2D animators, when you're animating in 2D, you have to really know what you're going to do first, because the page is blank. So you have to visualize and draw everything exactly as you intend to see it. And that really was an essential skill doing Tron, because there was no way to preview anything. Remember, there was no animation software, there was no preview software. So what we were drawing was going to end up being the final guide for the final looking film. And so you can see it was not just, and it wasn't like the computer guys looking at that image. It was us actually, it was helping us imagine exactly how big would it be, how fast would it move. As I'll show you, we ended up doing all these graphs to define the animation. So anyway, at the end of this, click a couple more, you're going to see a side, okay, there we go. So this is a side-by-side reel that shows you how accurate the drawings we did were to the final light cycle chase.
At the time you're drawing those boards, did you have any idea that you're going to actually be able to achieve something that matched that close? I mean,
Well, we'd been working with Magi Synth Edition, and they were the company that was going to make the three-dimensional models. Again, modeling in the computer in this day and age was not only like very primitive, but you have to realize that every computer company had their own software and their own hardware. There was no standard thing. There was no Maya, right? There was no Houdini. It was all, every company had a totally different, incompatible system. So you had to look at what every company had, and you could say, they can do this and they can do this. So the company that did the light cycles had a system that used solid geometry. Because the founder of that company, Phil Middleman, had been a doctor who had invented the MRI machine. And the MRI machine works on the principle of rays bouncing off bone, right? So he thought, why don't I have the same mathematics of the rays bouncing off objects and making light?
Because it takes a lot of CPU time, that's why not.
So anyway, they invented this, they get these guys, they wrote the software, but the only models you could build were models you could make out of mathematical primitive shapes. So you had a circle, a square, a triangle, a pyramid, a rectangle. You only had about 10 basic shapes, and by adding and subtracting shapes, you could make models, and that's how they made the tank and the recognizer and the light cycles. They made them by adding and subtracting geometric shapes, and that was matter. So we knew we had that, and then as far as motion, they had to move somehow, so we knew it was going to move.
what about camera? Because ultimately, probably no one's really invested in camera work at that time. Because
There was no camera.
I guess that's what I mean.
There's no
Like,
camera. The camera's your imagination, right? So anyway, we visualized. Yes.
Did Sid Mead understand Magi's
Nothing,
limitations?
no, nothing at all. It was never.
He just drew
we never,
something cool.
Sid and Mobius were never burdened with any limitations from the technology. They simply said, give us drawings, and we'll just stop posting the comments.
So it was just fortuitous that they used like a sphere for the front and kind of primitive models.
Yeah.
that
Well, if you really look at
fit-
if you really look at the real Sid Mead design, we couldn't really get all the way there. If you really compare it side by side, you're going to see that the Sid Mead design was a little fancier, and all we could really get was the one we ended up with, which is a little simpler. The Solar Sailor, which was an organic design, see, that was done by another company called III, and they actually had developed polygonal modeling, which of course is the way most complex models went after this. And polygonal modeling simply means you sit there and you set vectors and you connect them with polygons and you can have organic shapes. So that became the more complex and organic models were done by III. So continuing on, when we visualized this, okay, so now we knew what we wanted to make, right? We got it approved. How do you describe motion to a computer in an age when there's no animation software? So that's the Magi Synth Edition bike. You can kind of imagine it being add additions and subtractions of. So the first thing we had to do is how do we describe the motion of the bike? And we just went ahead, next slide, and we created this kind of simple guide. And we said, we had to define yaw, pitch, and roll because there are three angles, right? Where yaw, pitch, and roll, right? Those are the three basic angles that you move something. So we would define yaw, pitch, and roll, and it was very simple. If the bike, you can see the vertical tilt, negative and positive. So we had 0 as being, if the bike was tilted all the way up, 3 numbers to describe angles. Now we have to describe positioning. And that's a Cartesian world, which means it's an XYZ world, right? So basically it's XYZ. Where's the bike at XYZ? And to help us do that, we started to draw our graphs. And these were all hand-drawn graphs. This is a light cycle traveling through, this is a top view of a light cycle traveling through a canyon, right? So we would graph out, we designed dimensions of the canyon. We pretended in feet, we just picked a number. And then we started using the graph table. We started saying where it would be on frame 1, where it would be on frame 20, et cetera, et cetera. We started to do this next. And you can see this was an example of how a bike turns, We actually had the number of feet, 18.33 feet from the beginning of the turn to the middle of the turn, and the turn ends, and, pretty basic, But remember, we can't see any of this. We're just hoping that when somebody types all these numbers in, it's going to look okay. So go next.
Bill, can I ask, I mean, this must have been a huge departure from what you've been doing if you've been hand drawing character animation. Did this feel really foreign at the time? To be like doing graphs and, 18.3 feet and...
Absolutely terrible and awful. There are very few animators in the world that would have or could have done it.
That's a big
Because
transition.
it's like, imagine, I can't, running in cement shoes.
You're right.
I mean,
Just checking.
you have to have this, you have to go through all of this work to get something you could have done on paper in 2 minutes. So anyway, again, this was a camera move. You had to animate the camera too, right? You had to have position on every single frame of where the camera was, what it was looking at. So that was a graphic camera. Next. This was a rather complicated thing of 3 bikes. I don't know if you remember the scene in the movie with the 3 bikes. They just come out of the canyon and they skid to a halt right at the cliff edge. That's the graph of that. There you see the rate of deceleration of the bikes. Okay, right. And this is this is a camera move. The camera starts right behind the bike, and then it rises up and looks back as the bike goes. So that's the highly sophisticated way we did it. It was drawing graphs, writing, so that the guys would understand it next.
But you can, moving the camera to look down a 3-dimensional thing, that's pretty hard in hand-drawn animation, right? Is this a thing that's...
And there you have the revolutionary part of this way. No one had ever seen it, because you really don't move the camera in 2D, right? It's very laborious to draw the world changing. But that was the revolutionary thing about Tron, is nobody had ever gone into the world. Because now we're going into a dimensional world. And that's why moving the camera was so important to us. Because it was providing moves that basically no one had ever seen in animation, right?
And you're still plotting out physically how many feet the camera would be moving up.
Sure.
Right.
So, there's no such thing as motion software. We had to render each bike on every frame. So for 1 second to move in 24 frames, we had to say, frame number 1, you have these numbers. Frame number 2, you have these numbers. Frame number 3, you have these numbers. So think about this. We had an X sheet. Those of you in animation know a little bit about exposure sheets. This is a traditional animation since 1915. You would write down your drawings of how they were exposed and how many frames they were exposed, if you had a held cell, etc. So basically, this is an X sheet for one of the scenes. Notice on the left side, there are 6 channels, X, Y, Z, up, and 12. You had to have one for every frame of every object and every camera. Next. So anyway, 144 values per second. So trying at 15 minutes of computer-generated animation, 900 seconds of footage, with an average of 2 vehicles and a moving camera in each shot. That was 322,000 values we were going to have to hand figure out. And believe me, after like the first week, so I had a brilliant idea, and I take full credit for it. And I always have, without fear of contradiction. There's one computer on the lot, and it was on the Oxbury. And if you look to the right, there was a guy named, now if you ever work with an animation camera, see those dials below the table? They're little cranks, and that's what makes the table go left and right when you're doing pan moves and everything with an animation artwork. They were driven by, so what this guy, Bill Kroyer, figured out was he replaced the hand crank with servo motors, right? So they'd be electronically driven. Then he attached them to a computer, and he could type in beginning and end values, and the computer would do a basic B-spline, and ease in, ease out. So if you wanted to go from, have a pan move from here to here, you would just type in, okay, my camera's starting at 3 west, 4 south, and it's going to end at 6 east, 2 north. And you type that in, and you hit a button, and the computer would generate all the values on a B-spline between those 2 frame ranges. And I suddenly realized that's what we need. Instead of having to calculate and animate, 96 individual numbers for 4 seconds, all I have to do is give the computer this one and this one, and if I have some unusual moves in the middle, I'll put a couple of keys, and it'll do a spline through all of them, and I'll have all my meters, and that's what we did. Now, the bad news was, there wasn't any printer connected to this damn thing. So we ended up, if you believe this, we ended up taking Polaroids of the screen and sending them to the computer. Wow. Making them type them in.
Bill, was the idea that you would take those values and then enter them into the computer to adjust the image?
Well, that defined the location of the objects on every single frame, which is how you define
Where are
the
they?
motion and the speed. That's how that's what made the illusion of motion. You notice Tron has no motion blur. You probably don't know what motion blur is. There was no motion blur then at that time. So that wasn't an issue. You just placed things here, here, and here, and here, right? That's how you did it.
So did someone have to type in the values for every frame?
Yes, they did. They had an entire crew of people doing that.
Yeah.
So this is how we looked at the computers at the different companies would send their rendered images to, in this case, it's like a television set. It was like a cathode ray tube who's adjusting it, and then there's a 35mm camera pointing down at it. Or in this case, a 70mm camera. And then each image would be basically painted on the CRT, and then they take one photo, animation style, send it to the lab. So the very, very first time we would ever see motion animated was in 70mm.
Wow. That's
That's
awesome.
the first time. It would take us weeks and weeks and weeks. And we'd go to the soundstage, and they had a 70mm screen that was as big as this wall. And we'd stand there and we'd watch the light cycles. You know? And it blew us away. It blew everybody. I mean, if you can't imagine in 1981 somebody standing in the screen and seeing a 70mm image of those bikes coming right at you. Nobody's ever seen it.
Why did they shoot in 70?
Because we were finishing the movie in 70.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, the movie was all shot in 70mm. So we had to generate all our final imagery in 70mm. So remember, it's so primitive, there's no translating between, you're gonna finish in 70, you gotta shoot your test in 70. Right?
Do you know why they chose 70 instead of 35?
Grand, to have a grand epic film.
Okay,
They
okay.
shot the live action with the film with the camera they used for Lawrence of Arabia.
Wow.
Same camera. Okay. So anyway, is it seeing the lights on? Do you want to watch it?
Yeah, we want to watch it again. Sorry to go through
Never gets old.
Right.
So when we first saw this, it seemed very flat because all of the real lines were the same luminance. It didn't feel like it had depth. So again, somebody invented a very simple thing called depth cueing. And it simply meant the further away a line was from the camera origin, the dimmer it got. So that's why it appears, when you watch it, they appear to go, see how they go in the distance, it goes darker. And that was a great thing. We thought that was a great thing to come up with. So, does anybody ever notice Just notice the color discrepancy in that sequence. You notice how the bad guys are all driving blue bikes, even though Tron and Ram, they're all in blue light, they're in blue suits, whereas the bad guys are all wearing red suits but they're driving blue bikes. The reason is, this was the very first computer sequence we did in the movie, and they had not yet decided on the color of the character striping. And they intellectually thought that warm colors would be good guys. So they thought Tron and all those guys would be, and Flynn would all be wearing yellows, reds, and everything. And the bad guys would all be blue. But when they started to look at the tests of the light action shoot, they went, the blue looks really great, but the red and yellow, and so let's switch. So they switched. So all of a sudden now Tron and Flynn, they're all wearing blue. Well, we were halfway through the light seconds. And you gotta realize that this is such a difficult movie. We couldn't do reviews. We didn't have any money or time to do retakes. So when it came time to composite the actors into the bikes, we had to put blue guys in the red bikes and red guys in the blue bikes. Nobody's ever seemed to really be bothered by that.